comes from Exodus 14, verses 19 through 31. God's messenger, who had been found in Israel's camp, moved and went behind them. The column of cloud moved from the front and took its place behind them. It stood between Egypt's camp and Israel's camp. The cloud remained there, and when darkness fell, it lit up the night. They didn't come near each other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord pushed the sea back by a strong east wind all night, turning the sea into a dry land. The waters were split into two. The Israelites walked into the sea on dry ground. The waters formed a wall for them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians chased them and went into the sea after them, all of the Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and cavalry. As morning approached, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian camp from the column of lightning and cloud and threw the Egyptian camp into a panic. The Lord jammed their chariot wheels so that they wouldn't turn easily. The Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites, because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water comes back and covers the Egyptians, their chariots, and their cavalry." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. At daybreak, the sea returned to its normal depth. The Egyptians were driving toward it, and the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned, and covered the chariots and the cavalry. Pharaoh's entire army that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. The Israelites, however, walked on dry ground through the sea. The waters formed a wall for them on their right hand and on their left. The Lord rescued Israel from the Egyptians that day. Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the amazing power of the Lord against the Egyptians. The people were in awe of the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. The word of God for the people of God. The gospel lesson comes from Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16, and it talks about the workers in the vineyard. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. After he agreed with the workers to pay them a denarius, he sent them into his vineyard. Then he went out around 9 in the morning and saw others standing around the marketplace doing nothing. He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I'll pay you whatever is right." And they went. Around noon, and then around 3 in the afternoon, he did the same thing. Around 5 in the afternoon, he went and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you just standing around here with nothing to do all day?" "Because nobody has hired us," they replied. He responded, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the workers and give them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and moving finally on to the first." When those who were hired at 5 in the afternoon came, each one received a denarius. Now when those who hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they grumbled against the landowner. "Those who were hired last worked 1 hour, and they received the same pay as we did, even though we had to work the whole day in the hot sun." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I did you no wrong. Didn't I agree to pay you a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I want to give this one who was hired last the same as I give you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with what belongs to me? Or are you resentful because I'm generous? So those who are last will be first, and those who are first will be last."
The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. We all have a memory. A very first memory of our lives. In fact, we don't have the words because we haven't learned the words yet to remember it. We don't know that we remember it, but we must, because it is the memory of coming through the water and being born. All happens to all of us. All of a sudden we are cast into a cold world, maybe cruel. Baby will cry for 3 reasons. One is you haven't said anything yet, got to say something. Second is the doctor's either swatted her butt or the nurse has shoved something hissy down his throat, and that's irritating. And finally, the baby suddenly realizes, every baby realizes it is responsible for $58,000 of the national debt. Hey, I heard that joke back when I was about 10 years old, and it was responsible for $10,000 of the national debt. And I looked up on my inflation calculator. You know, $10 in the $10,000 is about the same as $58,000 now. In other words, our debt is what it is, and it's been about the same for all those years. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Don't let them lie to you. It's part of being a member of this and part of a citizen of this country, is that we have about a year's worth of work is involved in national debt. Kind of. Anyway, back to where I was at. Coming through the waters. Culture. Every culture has a crossing the waters. In Greek and Roman mythology, it is crossing the river Styx as one enters the underworld in death. And as you cross the thing, you have to pay coins to the ferryman. Pay the ferryman to take you across. That's why people put coins in the eyes of the deceased when they lay there in their coffins, is to have the coins to pay the ferryman. Goes way back. Crossing the waters. We've got a great story here. Starts off with the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob's son Joseph is thrown into the well, into the container of water, but it's a dry well because it's the end of the patriarchs. It's the beginning of a new age. Joseph is taken down to Egypt. He goes through all of his adventures there, rises up, and then his brothers and his father come, and he offers them a place to live and food to eat and a good life. And that lasts for about 400 years. And then comes a Pharaoh who does not remember Joseph. And the children of Israel are placed into slavery and oppression. God hasn't spoken to them since that dry well. Maybe that's what the dry is God is not talking to them. But along comes Moses, the Hebrew raised in the palace. He runs away from Egypt because he murdered a man. He's tending sheep out in the wilderness area, and he comes across that bush that is burning but does not consume. The fire that does not consume. And God calls him, even tongue-tied Moses, to go back to Egypt, the one guy who can do something about it. He's a Hebrew, and he is welcome in the palace. To say to Pharaoh, let my people go. And finally, after a lot of adventures and 10 plagues, Pharaoh says exactly that. And the children of Israel leave Egypt. And then Pharaoh says, what have I done? Go kill them! And he sends his army. And the army is catching up with them. God blocks the army with that pillar of fire and fog, and that makes it so the army can't get to them. But Moses and the children are up against a very solid fact. The Red Sea. Deep and wide. Now, Bible scholars over the years have been trying to say this in a way that people can believe. Because, it's like the family was driving home from church, and Dad said to his son, what did you learn in Sunday school? And he said, we learned about Moses getting to the Red Sea, and all the Pharaoh's army were behind him. And so he had the Seabees build pontoon bridge across the Red Sea, and all the people went across on the pontoons. And then once they were across, the Egyptians were following, and he had the Corps of Engineers blow up the bridge, and all the Egyptians and their tanks fell into it. And Dad says, I just can't believe that's what your teacher told you. And the son said, if you can't believe that, you're not going to believe what she said. But it's not about history. When we try to make things believable in the Bible, we're doing it for the people who have a hard time believing the Bible. So making it the Reed Sea, and the Israelites crossed on foot, and the chariots all got stuck. That's nice. But those who don't believe the Bible don't believe the resurrection. And they don't understand it. It's not a history book. It's not a science book. The Bible is a faith book, a collection of faith stories. And these stories tell us more about being born than what happened 1500 BC in the Sinai area, the Suez. Reed Sea. It's a little bit like some Amish in my area. When I grew up in Kansas, we had one Amish community decided that it was okay for them to have cars as long as they were plain. So they would buy black cars and they would paint the bumpers. We called them the black bumpers. Well, it's kind of the same thing here. We are black bumpering our story. This is a story about something that is unimaginable. Fortunately, we have Cecil B. DeMille who imagined it this way.
The Lord of hosts will do battle for us. Behold his mighty hand. God opens the sea with the blast of his nostrils. Lead them through the midst of the waters. His will be done.
He opens the waters before them, and he bars our way with fire. Let us go from this place. Men cannot fight against a God.
Better to die in battle with a God than live in shame.
Praise God and down into it!
This is about water and baptism. Paul wrote that as they moved through the midst of the waters, they moved through the mist of the waters, and the children of Israel were baptized as we are baptized. There's a story told, it's called a midrash, where when Moses held up his rod to spread the water, divide the waters, nothing happened. And the chariots were thundering in behind them. And this one person decided, I'm going to believe God and not the sea. So he walked out into the waters, but nothing happened. And the chariots were clattering behind them. So he walked deeper, he walked ankle deep, knee deep, hip deep, into the water, and nothing happened. And the chariots were clattering in behind them until he finally went in deep enough and the water splashed over his head. And then the waters opened up and parted on the left and on the right. That's the trust of God by an ordinary person. When we are faced with the waters in front of us, like I was telling the kids, we have these things that block us and bad things are coming and we're afraid that we're going to be drowned. But we have to remember we have been baptized. We may have been immersed. We may have had water splashed in our head. That works. And God is with us, and the waters, the struggle, the problem will be parted. And we can trust that. The Israelites travel through the waters and come out on dry land in a new world, in a new possibility, in a new promise, in a new truth. They follow God. And that's what passing through the waters is. In the hero stories, it's always a passing into a new stage of life. A new stage, a new possibility, a new hope. Even in Star Wars, Luke has to go to the swamps of Dagobah to meet Yoda. And he comes out in a new world, a new possibility. You see what God is doing when God parts the waters for us, invites us through the waters, invites us to be baptized, invites us to be reborn. It's all the same thing, isn't it? What God is doing is bringing us freedom through baptism. And it's not the freedom of just being able to go wild. It's the freedom of living life the way it needs to be lived in the real world. We are all caught up in living in a world where money means everything. I mean, money means a lot. But is it everything? We've got this consciousness that we should get a day's pay for days worked. And Jesus brings us this story about the vineyard. And these a bunch of guys go out first thing in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, to work in the vineyard, and they are promised a denarius. A denarius is 1 day's wage. And that's a good price. Day's work, day's wage. And they worked all day. But when they get paid, they discover these people, these Johnny-come-latelys, are getting paid a day's wage as well. And it just really ticks them off. I mean, when they saw these people who worked for 1 hour get 1 denarius, they thought, I've worked 12 hours. I should be good for 12 denarii. And then they get the 1. But it's not about denarii, it's not about money, it's not about management, it's not about labor, it's about life, and it's about freedom. God gives you a day's life for a day's life. Understand? You get life. And you have all of the time of life to live it as fully as you can. Because this is what God has given you, the freedom of life. I remember when I was struggling with what I was accomplishing and how poorly I was doing. I talked to a counselor and he says, well, you realize, who's the greatest person in your mind? I said, well, probably Albert Einstein. He said, do you realize that Albert Einstein lived 1 hour at a time, 24 hours a day, every day of the week, just like you do? You want to do something great, you have the same amount of time as the great ones. Because God has given you this freedom of life. And God is giving you the power to move through the struggles, through the baptism, through the waters into the cold world and life. Freedom through baptism. Thanks be to God.